By 1979, Clint Eastwood and Don Siegel had made 4 films as a team, and Hollywood knew the pairing as the engine behind Dirty Harry. Escape from Alcatraz would be their 5th picture together, and their last. Siegel shot it inside the genuine prison out on the Rock in San Francisco Bay, abandoned since the early 60s and rotting in the salt air, and the result still stands among the finest prison films ever made. What audiences never saw was that the production carried as much betrayal, danger, and conflict as the 1962 break it dramatized. The friendship behind the camera was coming apart while the cameras rolled, and decades later, on an ordinary evening, this single film would push a sitting American president toward an order almost no one saw coming. Number 1. The Writer Who Lied His Way In. A screenplay that several agents had already turned down, written by a man who had never sold a single thing to anyone in Hollywood, somehow landed in the hands of a director who loved it on sight. The man was Richard Tuggle, recently laid off from a health magazine and running low on both money and options. Desperate to get the pages in front of someone who mattered, he cold-called Don Siegel's agent and claimed he had met Siegel at a party. He hadn't. The two had never crossed paths. But the small invented connection was enough to get the script read, and a read was all Tuggle had been asking for. The material had been bounced before. Earlier readers complained about what they called poor dialogue and the complete absence of a love interest, the kind of dismissive notes that usually send a first-timer's script into a drawer for good. Siegel saw past all of it. He bought the screenplay outright, and almost overnight, a laid-off magazine writer with no track record had his first produced film attached to one of the most dependable directors in the business. The whole movie, in other words, rests on a single untruth told over a telephone line. Strip away that one fabricated introduction and the pages stay unread, Siegel never gets the call, and one of the most admired prison films of its era simply never exists. It is a strange foundation for a serious picture, a small lie that happened to open exactly the right door. Number 2. 15 miles of cable under the bay. The prison had sat dark and dead for 15 years by the time the crew arrived. Its old power plant long since shut down, the cells damp and unheated, and slowly rusting in the salt wind that never stops blowing across the bay. There was an easy way to make this movie, which was to build a convincing replica on a warm, dry soundstage. The production refused it. To shoot inside the building itself, the filmmakers ran roughly 15 miles of heavy electrical line out from San Francisco to the island, enough to light the cell blocks and feed the cameras in a place the modern world had simply switched off. It was an expensive and almost stubborn way to work, and that was precisely the point. The producers wanted the decay of the location in every frame, the kind of rot and chill that no set builder can fake, and they were willing to wire a power grid across open water to get it. The cold came free with the deal. Cast and crew worked in the same raw, bone-deep damp the inmates had once endured, and that misery is right there in the footage, in the visible breath and the gray light, and the way everyone on screen seems to be bracing against the building itself. Number 3. The escape icon cast as a jailer. Television audiences of the era knew Patrick McGoohan as the man who spent an entire series clawing at the walls of a strange seaside village that refused to let him leave. In The Prisoner, the cult British show that made his name, he was forever scheming and failing his way toward an exit that never quite came. So there was a certain dark wit in handing that same actor the role of the man whose entire job in this film is to keep other people locked inside. He had once been in the running for something even larger. Years earlier, McGoohan had reportedly turned down the chance to play James Bond, a single decision that would have rewritten both his career and the most lucrative franchise in movies. Instead, he came here to play the official who runs Morris's prison with a flat, watchful cruelty, a man who never raises his voice because he never needs to. That restraint is exactly what critics fixed on. His performance was singled out as one of the strongest things in the entire picture, a study in cold institutional authority that says more with a level stare and a quiet word than most screen villains manage with a whole monologue. The casting and joke, the escape artist turned keeper of the keys, became one of the movie's small and lasting pleasures. Number 4. The Prince of Darkness behind it. The film's blue-black, rain-slicked, deeply shadowed look came from one man, cinematographer Bruce Surtees, a master of low-key lighting who shot whole stretches of the picture in near darkness and let large parts of the frame fall away into murk. He had earned his grim nickname honestly, and he had earned the craft behind it honestly too, as the son of the great Ben-Hur cinematographer Robert Surtees, and, by this point, a recent Oscar nominee for his work on Lenny. He had already lit several earlier Eastwood pictures, including Dirty Harry, so he knew exactly how to wrap the star in gloom and let an audience read tension into a half-lit face. On the island, he took the prison's natural grimness and made it heavier still, a constant low-grade dread pressing in from the edges of every shot, never quite letting the eye relax. The damp gray of the cell blocks became, under his hand, something close to a kind of weather, an atmosphere the characters seem to breathe rather than merely stand in. That oppressive visual texture is a large part of what holds the film together, keeping the pressure steady through the long, near-silent stretches where almost nothing happens except Morris, alone, beginning to think his way toward the wall. Number 5. The film he chased for 13 years. Back in 1966, more than a decade before cameras would finally roll on this story, Don Siegel read J. Campbell Bruce's account of the 1962 break and was gripped enough to write a treatment of his own, a version of the material he called The Rock. No studio would touch it. Siegel was no stranger to the territory. Years earlier, he had directed Riot in Cell Block 11, one of the most admired prison dramas of the 1950s, so he understood exactly what a great film set behind bars could do. This was the story he wanted to tell next, and for well over a decade, he could not get anyone to let him make it. It went nowhere for well over a decade. Siegel kept the idea alive in the back of his mind through other projects and other films the way certain directors carry a single story around for years, unable to shake loose of it. So when Richard Tuggle's screenplay finally reached his desk, it answered something he had been carrying for most of his career, far closer to a story he had half written in his own head than to a cold submission from a stranger. That is the strange piece of luck sitting at the center of the whole production. A first-time writer's reckless gamble found its way to the one director on Earth who had been privately obsessed with this exact material for the better part of a career. And Siegel wanted it with a depth that went well past professional interest. He wanted it so badly that when the question of who would ultimately control the project finally came up, he would do something to secure it that ended up costing him far more than he ever expected to pay. Number 6. The set you can still visit today. What looks to the average tourist standing on Alcatraz today like the authentic and untouched interior of a notorious federal prison is, in large part, the handiwork of a film crew from the late 1970s. By the time the production arrived, the building had been closed for years and was visibly falling apart, so the producers reportedly spent something on the order of $500,000 restoring it, repairing the rot, and rebuilding the cold, lived-in atmosphere the cameras needed, dressing the cells to look the way they had during the prison's working life. When filming wrapped, most of that work simply stayed where it was. The crew had no reason to rip out good restoration, and the National Park Service, which manages the island as a historic site, had every reason to leave it standing. So, a great many of the cells that visitors now file slowly past, peering in at the bunks and the bars, are essentially the version a movie production cleaned up and refurbished in 1978. It is one of the odder legacies a film can leave behind. A national landmark absorbed a movie set into its own fabric and never gave it back, and almost nobody walking through ever realizes they are touring a piece of Hollywood. Number 7. Why the warden got a fake name. The official who runs the prison in the film never existed in life. The character, Warden Dollison, is a composite, a figure stitched together by Tuggle and Siegel out of whole cloth, and there was a very practical legal reason for inventing him, rather than naming a true one. The men who had run Alcatraz during the years the story covers were, for the most part, still alive when the picture went into production. Putting a living named warden on screen and turning him into the cold antagonist of a hit movie was a more or less open invitation to a defamation suit. So, the filmmakers built a fictional administrator instead, and the workaround came with a convenient creative bonus. Once the character on screen answered to no living person, the writers were free to make him exactly as harsh, rigid, and unsympathetic as the drama required, with no one standing by to insist that this was not how he had run the place. There is an irony folded into the whole arrangement. The man who in fact held the warden's post for much of that period, Olin Blackwell, was widely remembered as the most relaxed and easygoing administrator the prison ever had. The story needed a hard institutional villain, so it manufactured one from nothing, while the figure it might have drawn from was known, if anything, for going easy on the men in his charge. Number 8. The Steel on Steel final score. Composer Jerry Fielding, who had already scored The Wild Bunch for Sam Peckinpah, came to this film with an approach that broke sharply from the way movie music usually worked. Rather than writing the warm, swelling orchestral cues a prison drama might seem to call for, he recorded orchestral material and then deliberately manipulated it, bending, layering, and distorting the sound until it lost almost everything human and took on a hard, mechanical edge that matched the building itself. The result is one of the stranger film scores of its decade. It is an electro-acoustic texture that sounds closer to industrial machinery than to anything an orchestra would normally produce, all grind and pressure and metal. Where a conventional score would soothe an audience or guide their feelings, this one presses in on them, deepening the sense of cold machinery slowly closing around the men inside, and it does at least as much as Surtees's shadows to keep a viewer on edge. It was also among the last things Fielding ever wrote. He died in early 1980, not long after the film reached theaters, which leaves this uncompromising, deeply uncommercial piece of work standing as a kind of late signature from a composer who almost never reached for the easy or the obvious. He had his own blunt phrase for what he was after on this picture. He wanted, he said, the sound of steel on steel. It's Alcatraz. Number 9. The secret FBI files he was given. For a story drawn so closely from a true crime, the screenplay had an unusual advantage waiting for it. As Tuggle was writing, newly released FBI records of the 1962 escape became available to him. The investigative material itself, the documented account of how 3 men had vanished from a maximum security prison long thought to be escape-proof. That access shaped the texture of the entire film. The spoons patiently sharpened and widened into digging tools. The crude drill improvised from the motor of a vacuum cleaner. The papier-mâché dummy heads propped up in the bunks to fool the guards during the nightly count. The loosened ventilation grills at the backs of the cells. The procedural detail that makes the break feel so methodical and convincing comes straight from the documented record, not from a screenwriter's imagination filling in the blanks. What Tuggle did with those verified facts is where the film becomes its own thing. He kept the mechanics of the escape intact and faithful to the record, then layered invented characters and private symbolism on top of them, building his drama in the spaces the files left empty. The authenticity underneath is solid, and the inventions sit so naturally over it that the seams almost never show. That balance, the documented and the imagined working together, is a large part of why the film still holds up. Number 10. The graffiti they had to protect. Painted slogans, hand-lettered messages, and protest murals still marked the walls of Alcatraz when the crew arrived to shoot, left behind by the Native American activists who had occupied the island from 1969 to 1971. By the late 1970s, the place carried a double history: a notorious federal prison that had since become a landmark of indigenous protest, and the production was required to honor both at once. Under its agreement with the National Park Service, the crew was permitted to dress the location for the cameras only with temporary peelable paint. Nothing they applied to the walls could be allowed to damage or permanently cover what was already there. In effect, they were decorating a national monument for a Hollywood movie while under strict instruction to leave the monument's own history completely intact beneath their work, ready to be revealed again the moment the paint came off. It held. The occupation messages, including the defiant lettering still visible on the island's old water tower, survived the shoot and survive to this day, readable by anyone who makes the crossing. A film crew passed through one of the most layered sites in the country, did its job, and left the rock's history exactly as it had found it. Number 11. A future star's dubbed debut. There is a young inmate in the film, glimpsed only briefly while handing library books to Morris, whose face would within a few years belong to one of the biggest action stars of the next decade, even though the voice you hear coming out of him on screen is not his own. The actor is Danny Glover, caught here years before Lethal Weapon turned him into a household name, making what counts as his first proper screen appearance in a role so small that most viewers slide right past it. For reasons now lost in the ordinary fog of post-production, another performer was brought in afterward to dub over his handful of lines, smoothing out a delivery the filmmakers apparently were not satisfied with. So Glover ends up both present and absent at the same time, his face launching a major Hollywood career while his voice was left somewhere on the cutting room floor. And he was far from the only soon-to-be familiar name buried in the cast. Fred Ward and Larry Hankin both turn up here early in their careers as well, the kind of small, hidden detail that can turn a casual rewatch of the picture into a game of spotting the rookies long before any of them were names worth knowing. Number 12. The deal that ended a friendship. By the late 1970s, Clint Eastwood and Don Siegel had built one of the most productive working partnerships in American film. They were 4 pictures deep together and bound by genuine loyalty, a relationship that ran all the way back to Coogan's Bluff a decade earlier, the film where the young star and the veteran director first found their rhythm. Eastwood wanted this project for Malpaso, his own production company, the way he had steadily pulled so much of his career into his own hands. He assumed, reasonably enough, that the older man would simply bring the material to him as he always had. He didn't. Siegel, who had been chasing this exact story for well over a decade and had no intention of losing it now, moved entirely on his own. He went around Eastwood, bought the rights to the property himself, and set the picture up over at Paramount instead, taking the one piece of material he had wanted most across his whole career and refusing to let it slip into anyone else's control, even the control of a man he had been close to for years. To Eastwood, it felt like a betrayal, and the wound it opened never closed. They went ahead and made the film together regardless, 2 seasoned professionals doing first-rate work side by side while something between them was quietly coming apart. It turned out to be the last of their 5 collaborations. The rift never fully healed before Siegel's death in 1991, which is what gives a single small gesture afterward such weight. When Eastwood directed Unforgiven the following year and watched it sweep the Academy Awards, he dedicated the film to the two men who had taught him everything he knew about directing. One of them was Sergio Leone, the other was Don Siegel. Number 13. When Siegel feared they'd drowned. The water around the rock moves faster and far colder than it ever looks from the shore. A gray, churning, deceptively strong pull that has drowned experienced swimmers over the years. And Eastwood and his co-stars went down into it themselves. For the climactic descent, the long climb down the prison wall, and the plunge into the bay, there were no stunt doubles waiting to step in. The actors made that climb and entered that current for real, at night, on a shoot that had already pushed every person on it well past the edge of comfort. I want to stop and sit with what that must have meant for the man directing them. By his own account, set down later in his memoir, Siegel became convinced on 2 separate occasions during filming that the bay had taken his actors, that the cold and the current had simply pulled them under, and that they were gone. There is a particular kind of horror in being the person responsible for that, in standing there watching people you have personally asked to do something dangerous disappear into black water, and not knowing, for a stretch of seconds that must have felt like hours, whether any of them were coming back up. They did, both times. But the plain fact that the film's own director twice believed his cast had drowned tells you everything about how thin the line was between getting an authentic shot and causing a genuine tragedy. Just how close they came on those nights, Siegel never seemed entirely certain, and maybe that lingering uncertainty is the truest measure there is of the risk these men agreed to take. Number 14. Why they could only film at night. During the shoot, Alcatraz was still a busy working tourist attraction in its own right, with boatloads of visitors landing on the island roughly every half hour throughout the day, and the production was flatly not permitted to interrupt that schedule. The paying public came first, and the cameras had to work around them. That single constraint reshaped the rhythm of the entire job. With the daylight hours effectively surrendered to sightseers, a great deal of the filming was pushed into the dark, into the hours after the last boat had pulled away and the island finally emptied out. Stack that on top of the cold, the damp, and the long electrical line that had to be run out from the mainland just to keep the lights on, and the result was a production working largely after sundown, inside an unheated prison, around a public timetable nobody on the crew was allowed to touch. The location, in other words, set the terms of its own filming. With all of its rules, restrictions, and inconveniences, the Alcatraz they were working in dictated when the cameras could roll and when they had to stop for the day. And the strange, lonely after-hours mood that came out of all that compromise is sitting right there in the finished film. Number 15. Cast for muscle, not a resume. 2 of the supporting actors got their parts in large part because they were physically tough enough to survive what the script was going to ask of them. Fred Ward and Jack Thibault played the Anglin brothers, the pair who go over the wall and into the water alongside Morris, and those roles demanded a punishing climb down the sheer prison face and a swim out into the freezing bay. More than anything else, the production needed bodies that could take the punishment. Big names were almost beside the point. What the job called for were men who could plausibly, and then literally, make that descent in cold open water in the middle of the night, which meant physical conditioning counted for more than a polished list of credits. For Ward in particular, this was his first major film, a rare break that arrived without the long ladder of small parts most actors have to climb first. His background explained the casting better than any audition ever could have. Before he came to acting, Ward had been a boxer, had worked as a lumberjack up in Alaska, and had served a stretch in the Air Force, the kind of hard, weathered life that leaves a man able to scale a wet wall in the dark without it finishing him off. The film wanted that toughness standing in front of the camera, and in Fred Ward it got exactly that, not an actor's polished imitation of it. Number 16. Eastwood's only nude scene ever. For an actor whose entire screen image had been built on armor, on the famous squint, and the bone-deep sense that nothing in the world could ever touch him, the very opening of this film does something startling to that image. Morris is marched through prison intake with no clothes and no defenses of any kind, a hard, invincible-seeming man suddenly reduced to a single, vulnerable body standing in a cold stone corridor. And the sequence stands as essentially the only fully unclothed moment in Clint Eastwood's entire long career. It plays as something austere and stripped of all vanity, a deliberate peeling away of the untouchability he usually carried around him like a costume, with nothing remotely titillating in it. Before Morris has said or done a single thing, before the plot has really begun, the film has already told you exactly who he is. Just a man, alone, with absolutely nothing. Quentin Tarantino, a longtime and vocal admirer of the picture, has singled out the cold, stark beauty of that opening, and once you have seen it, it is not hard to understand why. And for all that raw exposure, the finished film still went out into theaters under a mild PG rating, a small reminder of how very differently the line was drawn back in 1979. Number 17. the quiet hit that shocked Paramount. The studio expected very little out of a slow, dialogue-light prison drama with no love story to speak of and no obvious commercial hook. A picture this restrained, this deliberately understated and grim did not look like gold on paper, and the people responsible for releasing it braced themselves for modest returns and a respectable, forgettable run. They got a sleeper hit instead. Made on a budget of roughly $8 million, the film went on to gross somewhere around $43 million in North America alone. A return that turned a cautious, low expectations release into one of the more profitable bets of Eastwood's entire run. Strong reviews fed the box office, the healthy box office fed still more attention, and the slow little drama nobody had pinned any hopes on kept right on selling tickets through word of mouth. Beyond the money, the success carried weight for both the genre and the partnership. It helped breathe new life into the prison escape picture as a form, just as the cycle seemed to be fading, and it confirmed for the industry that pairing Eastwood with Siegel was, in commercial terms, very close to a sure thing. The numbers put an end to any lingering doubt about whether two stubborn men could turn restraint, silence, and gloom into a film that ordinary audiences truly wanted to see. Number 18. The Real Man, rewritten as a coward. The film's most sympathetic failure, the nervous young newcomer Charlie Butts who weeps, loses his nerve at the worst possible moment, and ends up left behind when the others go, is a soft fiction laid carefully over a much harder man. Butts is based on an Alcatraz inmate named Alan West, and West, by almost every account, was nothing whatsoever like the trembling, fearful figure the screenplay invented in his place. In life, West was an aggressive career criminal and a determined repeat escape artist, very nearly the opposite of timid. Some accounts go further and credit him with helping to originate the 1962 plan itself, which would make him one of its driving forces rather than a frightened passenger. When the night finally came and the others slipped out through the wall, West was the one who could not work his own ventilation grill loose in time, and he was left behind in his cell. Afterward, he cooperated extensively with investigators, which is part of why so much of the inside story of the escape is known at all. The film took that complicated, hardened figure and reshaped him into a gentle coward, a tragic foil to Morris's cool resolve, simply because the drama needed someone on screen to be afraid so that the hero could look brave. How much of the escape West himself masterminded, and how much he later shaded in his own favor while sitting across from the authorities has never been fully untangled. The version up on the screen is a great deal simpler than the truth, and a good deal kinder to the man than the record. Number 19. The director hidden in his film. Watch the prison doctor who looks Morris over during his early intake, and you are looking at the man who was calling every shot from behind the camera. Don Siegel handed himself a small, uncredited cameo in his own picture, slipping into a single scene as the examining physician. Exactly the sort of private in-joke a confident veteran filmmaker likes to plant for the handful of viewers paying close enough attention to recognize him. It is the sort of thing you only catch once you already know to look for it. He was carrying on an old tradition, the director smuggling himself into a frame or two of his own work, and he was not the only familiar figure tucked into the background here. Eastwood's longtime producing partner, Fritz Mainz, also turns up among the inmates, one of a whole string of Eastwood movies he wandered into over the years as a recurring background face. Neither man's appearance announces itself, and neither one needs to. They sit there as small private signatures, deliberately placed in the corners of the frame and left as a little reward for whoever in the audience happens to be watching closely enough to find them. Number 20. The hatchet horror that was true. In 1937, more than 4 decades before any film cameras arrived on the island, a prisoner on Alcatraz did something so extreme that the movie would, years later, lift it almost untouched. His name was Roof Percival, and the disturbing act the film stages through its older character Doc was drawn directly from what Percival was reported to have done to himself. In the picture, Doc, the gentle older inmate who has been allowed to keep painting, is told that his treasured painting privileges are being taken away. Soon after, he turns a hatchet on his own hand in a sudden and shocking act of self-mutilation, a moment of pure desperation that erupts violently out of an otherwise restrained and quiet film. It feels almost too grim and too specific for a screenwriter to have invented, and that is precisely because the screenwriter did not invent it. Percival, according to the accounts that have come down to us, seized a hatchet during an outdoor work detail and deliberately maimed his own hand in much the same horrifying way. The detail on screen is documented Alcatraz history, transplanted whole into the drama. What gives that moment its force is a context the film mostly trusts the audience to feel rather than spelling it out directly. Alcatraz in that era ran on a regime of extraordinary deprivation, including, for long and brutal stretches, a punishing rule of silence that forbade inmates from speaking aloud for much of the day, a slow, grinding psychological pressure that wore men down in ways the bars and walls alone never could. Acts of desperate self-harm were, tragically, the kind of thing that environment produced. Some accounts suggest that episodes like Percival's may eventually have contributed to a loosening of the prison's harshest rules, though the exact chain of cause and effect is decidedly murky and still debated by historians. What is not in any doubt is the source. The single most shocking image in the entire film was lifted straight out of the prison's own recorded past, a true episode involving a man named Roof Percival, set down long before anyone ever thought to point a movie camera at the rock. Number 21. How it nearly reopened Alcatraz. Over a single weekend in May 2025, an old movie set off a chain of events that no screenwriter in their right mind would have dared put down on the page. A local PBS affiliate in South Florida, not far from the president's Mar-a-Lago resort, aired the 1979 film, an ordinary slot for an old and acclaimed picture. It ran on a Saturday night and then again the following morning. And by Sunday evening, the sitting president of the United States had posted online that he wanted the long-shuttered prison reopened and rebuilt as a working federal penitentiary. The timing was not lost on anyone who was paying attention. Reporting from outlets including Deadline tied the surprise announcement directly to those airings, noting that the film had run on the local station just hours before the president fired off his demand. A movie about three men breaking out of a shuttered prison had, in a strange loop, helped prompt a sitting president to start talking seriously about putting people back into it. Whether the order was ever remotely practical is a separate question entirely, and the proposal drew immediate and widespread doubts about its cost and basic feasibility. What lingers, though, is the sheer oddity of the causal line running through the whole thing. A cold 1978 shoot on a decommissioned rock, a film finished in 1979, a weekend rerun in 2025, and a presidential order to reopen the place arriving that same evening. It is one of the very few times a film this old has reached out of the past and, however briefly, nudged federal policy itself. Trump even seemed to nod at the strangeness of it himself, telling reporters that he was, after all, supposed to be a movie maker. Number 22. The flower that never existed. A small recurring image threads its way through the entire film, one that the documented history of the 1962 escape never contained. It surfaces first with Doc and his prison paintings, then again later in Morris's own hands, and finally as a single pale bloom resting on the rocks of Angel Island in the film's closing shot, a chrysanthemum that keeps reappearing at the story's most emotionally loaded moments. None of it was real. The motif was invented wholesale by Richard Tuggle, who built the entire piece of symbolism after learning that flowers grew somewhere on Alcatraz. From that one small true detail, he spun something the historical record never offered, a faint, hopeful suggestion woven carefully through the ending. That last bloom on Angel Island, lying across the water and well beyond the prison's reach, is Tuggle's gentle, deniable hint that the men might just have made it after all, that the long swim might not have ended the cold way the authorities always assumed it did. This is the seam where documented fact and pure invention meet most openly in the whole film. The hard mechanics of the escape came directly from the record, while this final grace note came entirely from a writer's imagination, layered delicately on top to send the audience out with hope rather than certainty. Whether Morris and the Anglin brothers ever truly reached dry land alive is something history has simply never settled, and the film, fittingly, answers the question only with the image of a flower that was never there. Number 23. The Christmas scene that was cut. Alone in his cell on the holiday, Morris lets a single gumball slip loose from his fingers, and it rolls slowly across the concrete floor and comes to rest just past the bars, only a few inches beyond the farthest reach of his outstretched hand. That small, devastating image was written into an early draft of the script and fully imagined on the page, and then it was dropped before it ever reached a single audience. It is one of the great quiet losses of the film's editing. That one moment captured almost everything the entire picture is about. The way long imprisonment slowly grinds away at every ordinary thing a person has, right down to something as small and stupid as a piece of candy you cannot reach. The scene needed no dialogue at all to say it. A man, a gumball, and a few inches of bare concrete that might as well have been a mile of open ocean. We will never get to see it the way it might have played on screen. The scene survives now only as a written description, a kind of ghost of the film that could have been, a small and perfect miniature of powerlessness left lying on the floor of the cutting room. Morris reaches out, the gumball stays exactly where it is, just out of reach, and that, in the end, is precisely where the finished film chose to leave it for good. There is a fitting symmetry to Escape from Alcatraz. It is a film about breaking free, made by two men whose own partnership was coming apart as they made it, and it stands as the last thing Eastwood and Siegel ever did together. Its grip on the prison escape genre has held for decades, and the true story underneath it still has no ending. The men who went into the bay that night in 1962 were never found, alive or dead, their fate left to the cold water and to everyone who has wondered since. Maybe that is why the film endures. It closes the way the real escape did, with 3 men gone into the dark, and no one able to say for certain whether the bay took them, or whether somewhere out past the lights of San Francisco they finally caught their breath on dry land.